Great. Welcome everyone to today's PhD Pathways event. We're very excited today to have with us Thibaut Pugin who was a graduate of the mathematics department here at Columbia in 2011. And my name is Rachel Bernard, and I'm the Director of Graduate Career Development. We do these events every month where we invite a different PhD alum from Columbia to come join us and talk about their career trajectory since graduating from Columbia and how they got there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Thibaut, to introduce yourself and tell us your story.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thibaut. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to talk to students from Columbia. I have really fond memories of that time. So a short introduction from my end. As I said, I'm Thibaut. I'm French. I studied math at Columbia. I think I did a master's and then PhD from 2006 to 2011. From there, should I kind of talk a little bit about my journey? I suppose that's the goal.
Sure. And then we can ask follow-up questions.
Okay, cool. Then I'll talk for a little bit. I studied math, pure math with Johan de Jong, great guy. If you see him, just tell him I said hi. When I did my PhD, I didn't sort of do this intentionally, but at the time I kind of ended up working on a problem that was at the intersection of two quite technical domains, which was a super exciting thing. And from what I can tell, a lot of the math that's come out in recent years and that's very prolific is often at the intersection of two technical domains that are being brought together. So I was kind of lucky to fall on a set of problems where you could do a lot of things. But what happened to me is I realized by the end of my PhD is like, look, I've done this kind of thesis plan by the beginning of my PhD, and that's probably going to be my research program for the next 10 years. And I'm super passionate about conceptual problem solving and understanding it. And it felt like I knew kind of what was going to happen, and it was all going to be sweat from there on. And so I had to think about it a bit differently. And what I realized is what I should have really done is to sort of work with others and really build a team and build a network of people who could help me solve these problems. But because this was at the intersection of two technical problems where not a lot of people had both competencies, it would take years to bring anyone to sort of have that competency, right? There were a few people in the world that sort of had this, and I met them at every seminar that I went to, and that was that. So my brain started turning a little bit around, okay, how do I work with a team? How do I create that high performance where I'm not going to be the bottleneck for making progress on whether that's that research problem or something else. And that really is the thing that at that time opened me up to think beyond kind of academia, because I'd been passionate about my problem, passionate about math forever. And so I didn't think any further. From there on, I kind of looked a little, and by chance, I don't even know how it happened. I kind of went to one of these career events on campus. It was in the lower end corner, I think next to the journalism school. And there was an event, I think by BCG, that was, so BCG is the Boston Consulting Group. They're a business consultancy company. And it was like, what does business consultancy management strategy do, right? Like it's a super abstract. And then there was this guy with a suit explaining, look, we sort of would have someone who studied musicology, an Olympic athlete, and an MBA, and we put them in a room, and then they solve a problem for the CEO of Pepsi. I'm like, either this is genius or this is completely bullshit. But either way, I kind of need to figure a little bit more out what that is. So I started talking to a couple of people, and they're there to recruit, right? So they're open to this conversation. I got a little bit into management consulting. And so what this meant for me was kind of two things. One is to sort of, through the conversation with them, I eventually joined I think it was a 3-day program where you could basically do a case study with a couple of other students, essentially. And you went through, here is what you do as a management consultant. You take some kind of problem that's more or less well-defined, and then you help structure it, and then you help kind of figure out some kind of solution for it. So there's kind of, okay, that's what you do. The other thing was, just out of curiosity, in the beginning mostly, is what people do in this management consulting circles looking for careers is they do a lot of case studies. which is, again, the same version of you get a problem and you have to structure the problem and kind of get some insights and some solution out of it, typically in anywhere between 20 minutes and an hour. And what I realized at the time, not always as consciously as I make it out to be, is what my PhD kind of helped me prepare for is essentially two things. One is understanding how to solve a problem. So I think if you're going to be researching something, you're going to go into the unknown somehow. Otherwise, you're not doing research. And if you do this, you have to find out how do you structure a problem. And so that's a skill that's intentionally or not, you probably have been or developing right now. The other is, if you actually want to make meaningful progress, you have to have some level of rigor that will help you sort of progress meaningfully. That can mean looking at data, that can mean a lot of different things, but applying some method that already exists. But basically, these are the two things that I felt like I learned from doing research is one, structuring problems and understanding how to create clarity and ambiguity. And then the second is to meaningfully apply rigorous processes to sort of get to insights. So I cut to the chase. I basically kind of did a set of interviews and then joined one management consulting firm called McKinsey and Company. I applied and then I joined in Amsterdam because my girlfriend is Dutch and I wanted to go back to Europe. I spent maybe 6 years over there, and it was a great learning for me to, I was not privy to the business world at all. I purely stayed in academia forever, and I was very happy and idealistic about what that looked like. And then kind of I had to look at now the real world, and you had a real job, and you had to wear a suit and all these things. And it was quite an interesting journey. I think some of the things that I realized quite early on is what I expected to happen would be I would be the numbers guy, coming from math, and that's surely enough. That's what they put me on early on, but I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't enjoy doing the Excel model. What I quickly realized is I had some really good strategic thinking skills, because when you do a lot of research, you have to think abstractly. So I was quite good at manipulating concepts and doing things like this. And from there on, you find your way in terms of skills and what you can do. The second thing that happened quite early in that career is, well, I had this quite nice routine when I was, through my PhD, where I would start quite early in the morning, usually around 5. And then the first 5 hours, my goal was to spend about 5 hours with white sheet of papers. And I had two rules. The first one was I could not use any book. It just had to be a white sheet of paper. So it had to be pure research. And the second was I had to throw away everything by the end. So it had to be pure thinking. Whatever your routine might be, I'm sure you have them, right? But to me, what it helped is, like, I was not scared of a white sheet of paper after doing this for quite a few months. And yet when I joined McKinsey, after a couple of months, they'll send you to this kind of leadership retreat, and they'll put a white sheet of paper in front of you, and they'll tell you, who are you and what do you want? And I was scared shitless. I had no idea who I was and what I wanted and what I was going to learn. And basically, that whole foray into management consulting has been an opportunity to sort of look at myself, look at leadership, look at who I want to be in the world, what kind of life I wanted to live, which was things that I hadn't really considered that much. And so there was a lot of self-growth that came from that. Eventually, I focused mostly on strategy in the beginning of my management consulting career. At some point, I moved on to more organizational topics, which means you're not just looking at what the strategy is, you're trying to make change happen. So you'll accompany an organization through a transition. It could be that they're trying to change culture. It could be that they're trying to scale their business. It could be that they're trying to a lot of different things. I ended up focusing on two things. One was how do you scale performance culture? So a lot of companies, when they start and they're really startup-y, they have this really tight-knit bond where everyone knows what's happening, and engagement is super high. You're super happy, and then after a while, you kind of it gets bigger, you have to put structures and processes in place, and bureaucracy takes over, you slow down, the energy dies down. How do you keep the entrepreneurial spirit from the beginning while you scale? So that was one of the big questions that I try to work on, and I helped a lot of companies try to manage that. The other is from a more systemic perspective is how do you help a company be agile? So agile is a very overused term that doesn't mean a lot of things to a lot of people. What it meant to me was, how do you help an organization stay stable, so have clear direction, but be very dynamic in terms of navigating the opportunities to go towards that? So very flexible in its approach. So these are the things that I ended up working on. And the reason that's relevant is because that's kind of what led to almost my next 2 career steps. After a couple of years, so six-ish years at McKinsey, I worked for a company called Zalando so I did a project for them. I think they're the biggest unicorn in Europe now. They've been the fastest company to ever get to be a unicorn in Europe. They're basically a tech fashion company, so you can go online and buy clothes basically, and they're a marketplace for that. And they were exactly at 8 years of growth. So they were 8 years old, so it's already quite a mature company at that stage. I think.
Can I interrupt to ask maybe a dumb question, but what is a unicorn in this context?
Oh, sure. A unicorn is a company that's valued at 1 billion or more.
Okay, I didn't know that. Thanks.
Yeah. If you live a little bit in the startup world, a lot of companies are trying to become the unicorn. And yeah, so that's what a unicorn is.
Got it. Thanks.
I'll go on for maybe a couple more minutes, and hopefully that's helpful, and then we'll go to questions.
Sounds great.
So I joined this company called Zalando, 8 years, and I think it was 10 billion in market capitalization. I don't know if that means anything to you. If not, 10,000 people, right? So 8 years from one person, or actually 2 people, to become 10,000. It's incredibly fast growth, right? So you have an organization that grew super fast, that had to throw people behind desks and in distribution centers and whatnot. And as you can imagine, if you do something like this, there's a lot of things that you do very scrappily and quite wrong. So how do you mature an organization like this to help it become more stable, but keep its dynamism again? So very much applying the set of skills that I had learned at McKinsey. My role there was to work in the people team, so in the HR department. Officially, my title was VP People Products. So I looked at things like culture, like performance management, like people data, diversity and inclusion, a lot of these things where I try to say, how do we scale these things and systemize them? Worked there for about a bit over 4 years. Incredibly happy with the company. And then my next gig, which I'm doing now, basically people knocked a little bit on my door, and it's a similar type of thing. My role is a bit different, but the journey is similar in that I joined a company that is now going on its 10th year. Again, a unicorn that is growing really fast. And it's now in the food business. So you have HelloFresh in the US. So if you're familiar with HelloFresh, it's a competitor to HelloFresh, much better, obviously. And the company is, again, trying to scale really fast. And that's one of the things that I'm bringing there. My role is a bit different. When I was in the people team before, I'm now leading the technology team, so digital products, which means basically my role consists in trying to lead technology teams who try to understand what are the customer needs and design apps, tools, products to satisfy their needs, and basically make a product that makes customer happy. I can go further into this. I know this is quite conceptual, but I could give some examples if that's helpful. In the interest of time, I'll stop here and kind of get directed by your question in terms of what's relevant to you.
Sounds good. Yeah, I might just ask a couple of follow-up questions and then open it to the audience. I'm curious. Thank you, though, for that really detailed and reflective and entertaining narrative, too. I'm curious to go back to grad school, your time in graduate school, And you mentioned, you said the things that a PhD helped you prepare for, like how to solve a problem and that you need a methodology to solve that problem. And then, and kind of the anecdote about the white paper. But I'm curious both about things, are there particular things that you did in graduate school or experiences you took advantage of? Like you mentioned the Bridge to BCG program, but I'm curious, were there any other like extracurricular things or clubs you were a part of or things outside of your research and writing that you did in graduate school that you think really helped prepare you? And then on the flip side, things now in hindsight you wish you had done.
Yeah, so I think that Bridge to BCG was one of them. And I mentioned the case studies. When I got into case studies, I realized that there was a consulting club or something like this at Columbia where people were actually doing that, right? And so I met a couple of people through this where we were pairing up and doing case study with one another. It's really hard to do it on your own, but I met a couple of people through that. I think some of the things that I did that in hindsight were super helpful is I had my kind of tight-knit group of people whom I was working with and kind of my class and etc. And it's a pretty, I would say, inward-looking department in maths. You don't really need a lot of, don't have dependency on others, right? So you look at what you're doing and kind of the other researchers, and kind of through TA-ship experiences, I did some, for instance, I did some courses for math finance, which was not at all my area of expertise. And there's a lot of funny experiences about this that I could tell if that's interesting, but it kind of opened me up a little bit to a different world where, instead of having the scruffy grad students who are super passionate and kind of come late in the morning, it was the people who had a job during the day and who crowded in, like 120 people crowded in a class at night when they were already like brokers or whatnot on Wall Street. And kind of, I started thinking a little bit about what's the use of the knowledge that I'm getting and how people value it. And it's kind of challenged me to not take for granted some of these things. So that was definitely an experience worth doing, even though it wasn't necessarily intentional at the time. The second is I took, I think, 2 classes which were about game theory, but they were in the business school. And it was such a different environment in the business school than it was in the math department, where everything was about collaboration and you had to do things in teams and together and etc. As opposed to you're doing your thing, and then when you need to talk to someone, you'll go and have coffee with them. It was a very much more structured approach. I think I learned a lot from that. So I think these are, in hindsight, the things that feel like at the time they were a little bit circumstantial. I've gained a lot from them. So I guess if there is any advice, and advice is kind of too much for this half reflection, right? Is more just try different things, right? Just don't stay only in your corner and kind of go out a little bit. And sometimes it may seem that it's not relevant directly, but it might end up being in the long term. It's the story of Steve Jobs taking the calligraphy class, right? It's a bit the same thing. Not trying to compare the same level.
I love those examples too, because they're at Columbia. It's not like you went and did something, because some people are like, oh, how do I find like a summer internship or something that seems very, difficult to attain and foreign, but these are ways of exposing yourself to different things by TAing and taking classes right here at Columbia. So I also, those are great examples. So yeah, is there anything that you wish you had done in hindsight?
It's a good question. I think maybe the thing that I didn't do a lot of is take some. So I was always keen to take some architecture class or go in kind of in a completely different dimension, and I've never done it. And I'm, you don't really get to do this late. I mean, that's not true. You can always decide to do this later in life, right? But it's so much easier when you're a grad student to go and do this rather than later when you have a job and more responsibilities and kind of a schedule to your life. And I think just expanding your horizon, I think, so to me, the bigger reflection is you're going to learn a set of skills during your research years, which are these meta skills that I've talked about already, around, solving a problem and having rigor around this. It doesn't really matter how good you get at the particular problem that you're solving. That's not what's kind of preparing you for life, right? I think what's preparing you for life is whether you get more enriching experience around it. So yes, you need to get your PhD, you need to sort of push that, and that's really important. But equally, you need to sort of expand your horizon. And I don't think that there's many places better than a campus to sort of get some of these opportunities to expand your horizons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. It's fine to dispense some advice. I have maybe just one more question and want to open it up to students. I know that in the audience here today, we have some students from a variety of disciplines across the graduate school, and that people who are viewing this will also have all different backgrounds. And so I'm curious, your PhDs in math, curious about the extent to which one needs, and this is something we talked about before, needs quantitative skills to enter the consulting field or have a career path similar to yours. And what you would say, again, I guess asking for a little bit of how you'd advise people who are interested in entering this field, say, from the humanities, but also people who have more like your background, like a quantitative background, but not not in quantitative finance or something that's like directly business related.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the most important aspect of this is to not see a separation between science and the humanities, right? They're just very complementary, and staying in one lane is wrong, right? And I think that's the most important thing that I can dispense. And if you look at almost any career, at some point you look at kind of the people who get senior, who progress. Most of what helps people progress is the fact that they're able to use words properly. So leadership is words. It's kind of things that you can write down. So the number of CEOs that have an English major is, I'm sure you could make some statistics about this, and I would bet some money on like that's pretty high. So those skills are really important, and they're very much complementary to skills like quantitative skills. So I think equally as much as when you progress, what's going to become more important is what's called EQ, emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, your ability to relate to people, your ability to understand how others work, empathy. And in particular, your words are super important because they help frame the context, frame the story of people. So that's what's going to matter more and more as you become more senior. I think when you start early on, you typically have more focus on developing technical skills. And so, relatively, that means focusing a little bit more on quantitative approaches. I think it doesn't mean you can absolutely join a consultancy, a management consultancy, without having taken advanced math classes. I think you need to be able to do simple modeling. You need to be able to learn simple modeling, right? So there'll typically be some kind of test around, can you understand orders of magnitudes? Can you do some simple basic calculation? And I would say it's more around conceptual thinking than it is around can you do your trigonometry. That's less relevant. But I also think that in today's world, you kind of need to master some level of quantitative understanding of things. I mean, if you read the news, you have to sort of know what the numbers kind of mean. If you've tried to grasp climate change and all these problems at some point, you need some kind of way to measure those things, right? So if you look at these problems, you're developing and deploying some quantitative skills. I guess if I had an advice to give, it's probably take a statistics class or something like this, right? To sort of get a sense of this and get a sense of how much people lie with data and how you interpret data. But I think you'll have to, one, know how to write, and two, know how to use data in your life if you want to get anywhere.
Yeah, great. I do actually have one more question that I didn't actually ask you before, so I'm curious your answer. So if someone wanted to go straight from a PhD program to working at a unicorn in something like on a team like yours, something having to do with people or research or user experience. Your path was via management consulting. I'm curious, could there be other possible paths, like if people wanted to go directly, and what kinds of roles would they, could they maybe go into, and how would they need to position themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll take the example of my last company where kind of the team that I led was the intent for the makeup of the team was basically 1/3 of people that came from the HR function, so who understood how that would work. 1/3 of people who came from a little bit of all walks of life, but typically think more business background, so who knew how the business really worked and could kind of make that connection and empathize with the stakeholders. So you had people focus, that focus, and then the third was typically PhD profiles actually. So people who have more often than not a quant background, but not always. So it could be also a social science background. And I mean, we had 2 research teams, right? And so what happened is people, so an example would be someone had been an epidemiologist and he'd sort of worked a lot on statistical epidemiology. And we hired him to sort of start becoming an analyst on people data. So he was trying to analyze data around what's going to drive attrition, and which means when are people leaving the company? What are some of the factors that drive this? So he was, trying to get some data in his computer and then do some analysis by respecting privacy of everyone, obviously, but to understand what are the drivers of people leaving the company, what are the drivers of engagement, how can we get insights to these things? He was really good at it, and typically the kind of people who get very deep into the problem and kind of or limit to themselves because they need to actually expand their skills beyond what they can do as an individual. So from there on, very much like after maybe a year or so, the conversation with him was, how do we get him more to leadership levels? Not because that's what he wanted, but that's how he could increase his impact. And so that's how he got into it. And I think there's quite a few of these profiles. Also, don't want to give the impression that any career needs to lead to a leadership role. Some people go into an analyst role and they kind of love it, and that's where they want to stay, and that's completely fine. Yeah, so I think there are these opportunities. And the team that I have today, it's a little bit trickier because it's, product management is a very technical competency. So it's rare that we hire people out of university. We have some kind of pathway programs where you'll do an internship and you'll work for a while, and then after that you build those skills. They probably don't value as much the fact that you've done a PhD than other programs. In general, like, look, if you know how to code a little bit, you can find your way anywhere, and then typically people will help you as well. So generally tech skills are in high demand today, and it will take at least 5 years for the demand of, or the supply of tech talents to catch up to the demand of tech talent that we see. So you have time to keep investing into technology skills and kind of still be in a highly demanded market.
That's great. That's great insight. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording